What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actresses comes face to face with a talk show host who thinks he can bulldoze through any conversation? What happens when years of built-up frustration finally explode on live television? You're about to witness one of the most shocking confrontations in talk show history, where Helen Mirren, the Oscar-winning powerhouse, absolutely destroys Bill Maher in a way that left the entire studio speechless. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about these two public figures. The tension was palpable from the moment Helen Mirren walked onto the set of Real Time. She had that look, the same steely gaze she perfected playing Queen Elizabeth, except this time it wasn't directed at unruly subjects, but at Bill Maher himself. Something was different about her usual composed demeanor. Her publicist had actually tried to cancel this appearance twice, but Helen insisted on going through with it. She had something to say, and she was going to say it whether Bill Maher liked it or not. Bill started the interview with his typical smug confidence, that self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face as he leaned back in his chair. "Helen Mirren, dame. Helen Mirren, thank you for being here. I've always wondered, does being a dame mean you have to curtsy to yourself in the mirror every morning?" The audience gave a polite chuckle, but Helen's expression didn't change. She simply stared at him with those piercing blue eyes that had intimidated directors and co-stars for decades. "Bill," she said, her voice carrying that unmistakable authority that comes from years of commanding stages and film sets. "I came here tonight because I have something important to discuss. Something that affects not just the entertainment industry, but society as a whole. I hope you're prepared for a real conversation." Bill's smirk widened. He clearly thought he was in control here. "Oh, I'm always ready for real conversation, Helen. That's what this show is about. We don't do softball questions here. We tackle the tough stuff, the stuff other shows won't touch." "Good," Helen replied, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Because I want to talk about the systematic way certain men in this industry, men with platforms like yours, have used their power to diminish women's voices and contributions. I want to talk about how some hosts seem to think that being provocative is more important than being truthful." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the light-hearted celebrity banter they were expecting. Bill's confidence wavered for just a moment before he recovered, but Helen had already noticed the crack in his armor. "Whoa, hold on there, Helen," Bill said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "That's quite an accusation. I've had plenty of women on this show. I've been a supporter of women's rights for years. I think you might be painting with a pretty broad brush there." Helen leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper she used when delivering her most powerful lines on screen. "Bill, I've watched your show for years. I've seen how you interrupt female guests, how you dismiss their expertise, how you make jokes about their appearance instead of engaging with their ideas. And I've watched other women in this industry stay silent about it because they're afraid of being labeled difficult or losing opportunities." "That's not true," Bill protested, but his voice had lost some of its usual bravado. "I treat all my guests equally. I ask tough questions." "Yes, but that's my job. That's what people tune in for." "Really?" Helen's eyebrow arched in that way that had made her famous for playing queens and matriarchs. "Then explain to me why last month, when you had Dr. Sarah Chen on to discuss climate change, you spent the first 5 minutes of her segment making jokes about her accent, instead of letting her present her groundbreaking research. Explain to me why you felt the need to comment on Senator Williams' dress before asking her about healthcare policy." The color started to drain from Bill's face. He clearly hadn't expected Helen to come armed with specific examples. Those were just, icebreakers, ways to make the guests more comfortable. Comfortable. Helen's voice rose slightly, and for the first time, some real emotion crept in. "Bill, do you have any idea how uncomfortable it is to be a woman trying to be taken seriously in your field, only to have some man make jokes about your appearance or your voice before you can even speak? Do you know what it's like to prepare for months for an interview, to have important things to say, only to be reduced to a punchline?" Bill was starting to look genuinely rattled. Now, this wasn't going according to his usual script. Usually, when guests pushed back, he could deflect with humor or change the subject. But Helen wasn't letting him off the hook. She was relentless, like a prosecutor who had been building a case for years. "Helen, I think you're being a little unfair here," Bill said, his voice taking on a slightly whiny quality. "I mean, comedy is part of what I do. People expect certain things from this show. It's not always going to be completely serious." "And there it is," Helen said, sitting back in her chair with a look of satisfaction. "The excuse. It's just comedy, right? It's just jokes. Except when those jokes consistently target women. When they consistently undermine our credibility. When they consistently reduce us to objects of ridicule, rather than human beings with something valuable to contribute, then it stops being comedy and starts being something else entirely." The studio was dead silent now. Even the crew members, who had been moving around quietly in the background, had stopped what they were doing to listen. This was unlike anything they had ever witnessed on the show. Bill tried to regain his composure, straightening his tie and forcing his trademark smirk back onto his face. "Okay, Helen, I hear what you're saying, but I think you're taking this way too seriously. I mean, can't we just have a little fun here? Isn't that what entertainment is about?" Helen's eyes flashed with something that looked dangerously close to fury. "Fun? Bill, you think it's fun when young actresses come to me in tears because they've been humiliated on national television? You think it's fun when brilliant women start second, guessing themselves because they've been told their ideas don't matter as much as their appearance? You think it's fun when entire generations of women learn that their value is determined by how well they can take a joke, rather than by their talent, intelligence, or contributions?" The camera captured every micro-expression on both their faces, Helen's righteous anger contrasting sharply with Bill's growing discomfort. He was clearly out of his depth here, facing an opponent who was not only more prepared than he was, but who also had the moral high ground. "I never said," Bill began, but Helen cut him off with a gesture that would have made any director proud. "You didn't have to say it, Bill. You showed it every single time you chose to make a joke instead of asking a substantive question. Every time you talked over a female guest, every time you reduced a woman's complex thoughts and feelings to a simple punchline, you showed exactly what you think of women. And frankly, it's not very flattering." The audience was completely captivated. Now, this wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a masterclass in how to hold someone accountable for their actions. And Helen Mirren was the professor. Bill's face was starting to turn red, and not from embarrassment. You could see the exact moment when his shock transformed into defensiveness, then into something uglier. His hands clenched into fists on the desk, and that fake smile he'd been struggling to maintain finally disappeared completely. "Now wait just a minute, Helen," he said, his voice rising to match hers. "I've been doing this show for years. I've won awards. I've broken important stories. I've given platforms to people who wouldn't get them anywhere else. And you're sitting here acting like I'm some kind of monster just because I try to keep things light sometimes." Helen's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Light? You call systematic dismissal of women's voices keeping things light? You call reducing accomplished professionals to their physical appearance keeping things light? Bill, the only thing light about your approach is how little respect you show for half the population." "That's ridiculous," Bill shot back. "No pretense of professionalism gone now. I've had women on this show who've become major political figures. I've helped launch careers. I've supported women's causes. Have you?" Helen's voice was dangerously quiet now. The kind of quiet that made even seasoned actors nervous. "Or have you simply used women as props in your own narrative? Tell me, Bill, when Senator Martinez was on your show discussing immigration reform, how much time did you spend on her policy proposals versus how much time you spent making jokes about her being a former beauty queen?" Bill's jaw tightened. "She brought up the beauty queen thing herself. After you brought it up first," Helen countered smoothly. "I watched that interview, Bill. I watched you steer the conversation away from her expertise in constitutional law, away from her 15 years of public service, away from her groundbreaking legislation, and towards something that happened when she was 20 years old. You made her defend her entire career based on one irrelevant piece of her past." The studio audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Several crew members had stopped pretending to work and were openly watching the confrontation unfold. This was television history in the making, and everyone knew it. Bill tried a different approach, his voice taking on a condescending tone that made several people in the audience visibly cringe. Helen, I think you're being a little emotional about this. Maybe you're taking this too personally. I mean, you've had a great career. You've won awards. You've been successful. Why are you so angry about things that don't really affect you? If looks could kill, Bill Maher would have been incinerated on the spot. Helen's eyes went completely cold. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every powerful woman who had ever been told she was being too emotional. Emotional, Bill. I'm emotional because I care about the next generation of women who will sit in chairs like this one. I'm emotional because I've spent 50 years in this industry watching brilliant women be reduced to footnotes in men's stories. I'm emotional because young girls are watching this right now. And they're learning that no matter how hard they work, no matter how much they achieve, there will always be men like you who think their feelings and opinions matter more than women's facts and expertise. Bill was clearly losing control now, his face getting redder by the second. Men like me. What exactly is that supposed to mean? I'm not some caveman, Helen. I'm a progressive. I fought for women's rights my entire career. Fighting for women's rights and respecting women are two different things, Bill. Helen replied with devastating calm. You can support a cause in theory while still treating the actual women in front of you like they're less than human. You can vote for the right policies while still believing that women exist primarily for your entertainment. That's not true. Bill protested, but his voice was getting higher and more strained. I don't think that at all. I have female friends. I date women. I work with women. Helen's expression shifted to something that looked almost like pity. Bill, the fact that you just said, I date women, as evidence that you respect women, tells me everything I need to know about how you view relationships with women. We're not trophies to be collected or conquests to be bragged about. We're human beings with our own thoughts, feelings. Don't psychoanalyze me. Bill snapped, his composure completely shattered. Now, you don't know anything about my personal life or my relationships. You're right, Helen said, her voice steady as a rock. I don't know about your personal life, but I know what I see on this show every week. I know how you treat women guests differently than male guests. I know how you interrupt us more, how you question our expertise more, how you make us prove our worth in ways you never ask of men. Bill was starting to sweat now, loosening his tie as if it were choking him. You're twisting everything. You're making me sound like some kind of villain when all I'm trying to do is have interesting conversations. Interesting for whom? Bill. Helen's question hit like a sledgehammer. Interesting for you. Interesting for your male viewers who enjoy watching women be put in their place. Because I can guarantee you, it's not interesting for the women who come on this show hoping to discuss their work, their ideas, their contributions to society, only to spend their time defending their right to be taken seriously. The camera zoomed in on Bill's face, capturing every bead of sweat, every twitch of frustration. He looked like a man who had finally met his match and was realizing he was completely outgunned. I think you're being completely unfair, he said, his voice now carrying a whiny quality that made him sound like a petulant child. I've had hundreds of women on this show. If what you're saying is true, why hasn't anyone else complained? Helen's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. Oh, Bill, you really think no one else has complained? You think I'm the first woman to notice your behavior. The difference is I'm at a point in my career where I don't need anything from you. I don't need your approval. I don't need your platform. I don't need your validation. Most importantly, I don't need to stay silent to protect my future opportunities. So, what are you saying? Bill asked, his voice now openly hostile. That other women are just lying when they say they had good experiences on the show? I'm saying that women have been trained from birth to smile and nod and pretend everything is fine even when it's not. Helen replied with devastating precision. I'm saying that women have learned to laugh at jokes that aren't funny, to accept behavior that's unacceptable, to make men feel comfortable even when those men are making us profoundly uncomfortable. And I'm saying that I'm done with all of that. Bill stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. This is my show and I don't appreciate being attacked by someone who clearly has some kind of agenda. Helen remained seated, perfectly composed, even as Bill towered over her. There's that word again, Bill. Agenda. Because a woman speaking truth to power must have an agenda, right? She couldn't possibly just be tired of watching injustice play out night after night on national television. "You're damn right you're not going to sit here and attack me on my own show," Bill said, his voice now loud enough that several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Security!" The word hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. The audience gasped collectively, several people audibly saying, "Oh my God," or "I can't believe this is happening." Helen's eyebrows raised slightly, but she didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting this exact reaction. Helen slowly stood up, her movements deliberate and dignified, like a queen rising from her throne. She looked directly into the camera, completely ignoring Bill, who was now frantically gesturing to his production team. "Laddies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned studio, "you've just witnessed something remarkable. You've seen what happens when a man who has built his career on controlling narratives suddenly loses control of his own narrative. You've seen what happens when someone who dishes out criticism daily can't handle even the mildest criticism in return. Get her out of here," Bill shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "I said security." Two security guards appeared from the wings, looking extremely uncomfortable with the situation. They approached Helen hesitantly, clearly unsure about forcibly removing one of the most respected actresses in Hollywood from a television set. Helen turned to face them with a gracious smile. "Gentlemen, don't worry. I'll leave voluntarily, but before I do, I want to make sure everyone understands what just happened here." She turned back to the camera, and her next words were delivered with the kind of commanding presence that had made her legendary. "Bill Maher just proved every single point I made tonight. When presented with facts about his own behavior, he became defensive. When asked to account for his actions, he became hostile. When challenged by a woman who refused to be silenced, he tried to have me physically removed from the premises. This, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly the kind of behavior that women face every single day in workplaces, in boardrooms and classrooms, and yes, on television shows." Bill was practically purple now, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. "You're twisting this. You came on my show to attack me. You had an agenda from the minute you walked in here." Helen turned to look at him with something that looked almost like sympathy. "Bill, my only agenda was to have an honest conversation about how women are treated in this industry. The fact that you see honesty as an attack says far more about you than it does about me." Honest conversation. Bill's voice was now at a volume that was making the audience visibly uncomfortable. "You ambushed me. You came here with some feminist manifesto and tried to make me look like the bad guy." "I didn't make you look like anything, Bill," Helen replied with devastating calm. "I simply gave you enough rope and you hung yourself with it. Every word that came out of your mouth tonight, every defensive reaction, every attempt to dismiss what I was saying, that was all you. I didn't put those words in your mouth." The security guards were now standing awkwardly beside Helen, clearly hoping she would just leave on her own so they wouldn't have to physically escort her out. One of them cleared his throat nervously. "Mom, we're going to have to ask you to leave now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen nodded graciously. "Of course. I understand you're just doing your job." She gathered her purse and began walking toward the exit, but then she paused and turned back one more time. "Bill, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I don't even particularly dislike you. What I feel for you is something much worse than hatred. I feel sorry for you. I feel sorry for a man who has been given such an incredible platform, such an amazing opportunity to make a difference in the world, and who has chosen to use that platform to make women feel small instead of helping them feel empowered." Bill's face was now a mottled red and white, his hands shaking with fury. "Don't you dare pity me. I've accomplished more in my career than you could ever dream of." Helen's laugh was genuinely amused now. "Oh, Bill, do you really want to compare accomplishments? Do you want to talk about artistic legacy? Do you want to discuss the impact we've had on culture, on society, on the people who look up to us? Because I'm happy to have that conversation, but I don't think it's going to go the way you think it will." The audience was completely captivated. Some people actually leaning forward in their seats. Several were openly filming with their phones, despite the show's no recording policy. This was the kind of moment that would be talked about for years. "Get out!" Bill screamed, his voice now hoarse from shouting. "Just get out of here." Helen smiled serenely. I'm going Bill. But before I do, I want to leave you with something to think about. Tonight, you had the opportunity to engage with a woman who came here in good faith, wanting to have a meaningful conversation about important issues. Instead, you chose to get defensive, to make excuses, to try to silence me when I wouldn't back down. The question you need to ask yourself is this: if you can't handle one woman speaking truth to your face, how can you possibly claim to be an ally to women in general? She began walking toward the exit again, the security guards flanking her, but clearly reluctant to actually touch her. As she reached the edge of the stage, she turned back one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for witnessing this tonight. I hope you'll remember what you've seen here. I hope you'll remember that when women speak up about injustice, we're not being emotional or difficult or agenda-driven. We're being human beings who refuse to accept being treated as less than human beings. And I hope you'll remember that when someone reacts to criticism by trying to silence the critic, they're usually proving that the criticism was justified. Bill was now standing behind his desk, breathing heavily, his tie completely askew, his hair disheveled. He looked like a man who had just been in a physical fight and lost badly. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. But his voice was no longer carrying the same authority it had at the beginning of the show. Absolutely unbelievable. Helen paused at the very edge of the stage just before disappearing into the wings. "Bill, there's one more thing I want to say. Every woman watching tonight, every young girl who might see this, I want you to know that you don't have to accept being talked down to. You don't have to laugh at jokes that aren't funny. You don't have to make men comfortable at the expense of your own dignity. You have the right to speak up, to push back, to demand better. And if men can't handle that, well, that's their problem, not yours." With that, she walked off the stage, leaving Bill standing alone in front of an audience that was still processing what they had just witnessed. The studio was so quiet you could hear the camera equipment humming. Bill tried to regain his composure, straightening his tie and attempting to smile for the cameras. "Well, folks, that was certainly something. I guess sometimes guests come on the show with their own agendas and, well, you saw what happened." But his words fell flat. The audience wasn't buying his attempt to spin what had just occurred. Several people were shaking their heads. Others were whispering to each other, and more than a few were looking at him with expressions that ranged from disappointment to disgust. "We're going to take a quick break," Bill said, his voice lacking any of its usual confidence. "We'll be right back." As the camera stopped rolling, the studio erupted in whispers and murmurs. Bill slumped into his chair, finally allowing the mask to slip completely. He looked like a man who had just realized that his entire worldview had been shattered in the span of 30 minutes. Meanwhile, Helen Mirren walked out of the studio with her head held high, having delivered one of the most powerful performances of her career. Not on a movie set, not on a theater stage, but in real life, standing up for women everywhere who had been waiting for someone to finally say what needed to be said. The footage of this confrontation would be analyzed, discussed, and debated for years to come. But one thing was absolutely clear: Helen Mirren had just schooled Bill Maher in a way that no one would ever forget. So, what do you think? Was Helen Mirren right to call out Bill Maher's behavior, or did she cross a line? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines. Because sometimes the most important conversations happen when the cameras are rolling and no one can hide behind their public persona. Who do you think was right in this argument? Comment below.